Hello! So I thought it'd be interesting to make a video about a vintage Eventide Clockworks effects processor, the Instant Flanger, released in 1975, particularly in relation to David Bowie, because his producer, Tony Visconti, used this very effects processor to create the unusual piano sound on Ashes to Ashes. But before we get to David Bowie, we need to ask the question, what is the Instant Flanger? And in fact, what is flanging? So flanging was originally a physical mechanical process. You'd have two tape machines playing back, crucially, the exact same recording in sync with one another, and the output would be recorded to a third tape machine. What you would then do is push on this tape machine manually so that it was slightly ahead of this tape machine, not so much ahead that you get an echo, but just ahead, so you're talking milliseconds ahead. You then put your finger on the edge or the flange of this tape reel, and the friction causes the machine to slow down, and it will come back in sync with the second machine and then go behind it. You can then push it back on to catch back up again, or you could put your finger on the flange of this tape machine to slow it down. And so long as the signals stay within a small range, but drift past one another in terms of time, an interesting phenomenon occurs where you will get a series of notches or nulls in the frequency spectrum. And as the delay moves, they will move about. And if you look at them on a spectrograph, they look like the teeth of a comb, and it became known as comb filtering. Now, whilst this was a brilliant effect and it was used loads in the psychedelic 1960s, probably most famously on Ichiku Park by the Small Faces, it was expensive and laborious to set up and also difficult to perform because ultimately you're jabbing around with tape machines in ways they weren't designed to be played with, and so it'd be difficult to get a performance of flanging right. So, no doubt engineers thought, if only there was a more instant way to flange. Well, actually, prior to the Instant Flanger in 1971, there was an earlier effect, the Instant Phaser. And nowadays we make a distinction between phasing and flanging, two closely related but distinctly different effects. Back in the day, they didn't really make that distinction. They used the terms phasing and flanging interchangeably, and so the Instant Phaser was also intended to emulate tape flanging. Now, the reason effects like this were possible was down to the introduction of bucket brigade delay chips. Those are analog chips that take an incoming signal and delay it and then output it, and also inherently colour the sound as part of that, which is the joy of BBDs. And that allowed for things like compact delay pedals, choruses, ensembles, and of course, flangers. So the Instant Flanger is interesting because it has two BBDs in series, and that allows for longer delay times but also less loss of high frequency content. But it also afforded them an interesting opportunity, which they took full advantage of. So the two BBDs in series come out of the main output, but one BBD comes out of an auxiliary output. So you've got two delayed signals at different time intervals, plus the dry signal, and that allows you to create all sorts of pseudo-stereo shenanigans. So to explain how it works, I'll just run some audio through it. Nice little sequence. So let's bring in the flanger. And the first thing you can do is adjust this main manual knob here. And then next, you've got this effect modifier section, and the first control is bounce. Now what this does is emulates the way when you're doing physical tape flanging and you let go of the tape machine that you're slowing down and it comes back up to speed. It doesn't seamlessly, smoothly come back up to speed like James Bond landing in that plane in GoldenEye. It kind of, whoa there, Sally. And so this emulates that bounce. That's the idea. And it's kind of funny if you're looking at your, I don't know, Strymon with its tape wow and flutter, or your Prophet 5 with its vintage knob, There's nothing new under the sun. This is a vintage effect emulating an even more vintage effect. There we go. Next, we've got this depth control. So this is a little bit harder to explain, but I've put a link in the description to the manual that goes into it in great detail. But essentially what you've got, sorry I can't resist doing this the whole time, what you've got is your two outputs, your double BBD, your single BBD, and then you've got the dry signal, which is not delayed, which you can play around and blend in with one more on one of the outputs or more on the other, and it affects the phase and also affects the frequency content. It makes it seem like it's moving around. You can really hear the bass on that reinforcement, and then the cancellations. So even with just those controls, there's a lot you can do. You then have modulation from an LFO. And or from an envelope follower, which can be inverted. You could do all of this at the same time. On the original, there's a jack input there for remote control. This one's been modded, and you can use this as well. I don't know what the circuit is inside that's been put in its place, but that's not how it was on the original. But yeah, between these knobs, you've got a lot of different variations you can do. So let's listen to a few sounds. So now that we know what flanging is and how the instant flanger works, let's get to David Bowie. So in an interview with Tony Agnello of Eventide, on the Eventide channel, which I've linked in the description, Tony Visconti says that he wanted to record a Wurlitzer on the song Ashes to Ashes, a nice stereo Wurlitzer, but the Wurlitzer was broken, so he thought, maybe I could make something like that with the instant flanger. But he couldn't. But what he could make was something far more interesting. Let's see if we can recreate it. So we're at the piano. First thing, we're going to add the flanger. And crucially, we're going to add modulation from the oscillator, which is a low frequency oscillator. It's a triangle wave at quite a fast rate, so it can go even faster. It can go slow, but it's somewhere about there. And then we can bring in the envelope follower. back it off a bit, or make it more extreme. It is quite extreme on the record, but not that extreme. Starting to get close to it, and that pitch modulation, I think, is actually an emulation of the Doppler effect. You know, when you're stood there and a fire engine goes past, that kind of thing. And the last thing they added was stereo plate reverb. I'm going to add stereo spring. It's a pretty nice sound. Let's play something else with it. So what's interesting about that effect is Tony Visconti said that when they were recording, they recorded with the effect on. It wasn't added in the mix. So the pianist, who I believe was Roy Bittan, could hear the effect and performed with it in context. And then they were committed to it. They were stuck with it. They couldn't change it, which is a great way to approach it with effects. You know, that's the effect, go with it. I really like that they did that. And it's a really interesting and unusual sound and an unusual use for a flanger. And if you like that sound, I have made some samples from my piano whilst it was hooked up. Sounds like this. And that is available on the top tier on my Patreon, as is the music from this video. Thank you to my patrons for their support. And of course, thank you to you for watching.